Hello. Hi, everyone. Can you see me and hear me? Yeah, I think it's fine. My name is Amir Parjun. Good morning. I'm in New York, so good afternoon if you're joining us from across the Atlantic. I'm coordinator for Art Science Connect. We're a CUNY Graduate Center-based center that brings scientists and artists and interdisciplinary thinkers and scholars together for a public conversation and innovative programs that encourages and hosts forward-looking collaborations in the intersection of art and sciences. Today, we're very pleased to launch the second program of Innovation Sound Technology with Marc Yeats and Philippe Kocher. This is the second installment of a series planned by Arts and Science Connect Fellows, Tobias Fandel and Itza Garcia. They also planned another event that you'll be able to see at the Arts Science Connect website soon. I want to thank our supporters, lastly, the James Family Charitable Foundation and the Al Health Foundation, and to hand over the mic and the screen to Tobias and Itza. Hi.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you
Hello.
so much. Thank you so much for joining today. We're very excited to present our guests for this day, morning, afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. So I start by presenting Dr. Marc Yeats. Dr. Marc Yeats is an internationally performed, commissioned, and broadcast British composer, abstract landscape painter, and practice researcher. His work as a painter and composer is closely linked to techniques developed over many years, with compositions influencing new approaches to painting and techniques in painting influencing musical development. Marc continues to push his compositional horizons. His recent projects include the incorporation of mobile phone technologies that employ user-responsive materials in geolocated contexts where audiences can walk through his compositions and explore them. He also creates live performance formats through a range of polytemporal structural approaches, including his time-coded supported polytemporal composition method, developed as an AHRC-funded PhD research project at the School of Music University of Leeds between 2017 and 2021. Marc has recently published the album Solo and Ensemble Music Volume 2, released under his own record label, Polytempo Records. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you very much.
Hi, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our second guest, Philippe Kocher. Philippe is a musician, composer, and researcher. He studied piano, electroacoustic music, music theory, composition, and musicology in Zurich, Basel, London, and Bern. Philippe's work encompasses instrumental and electroacoustic music as well as sound installations. His artistic and scientific interests include algorithmic composition and computer-generated music and art. He conducts research at the Institute for Computer Music and Sound Technology, ICST, in Zurich, and Philippe teaches music theory and composition as a professor at the Zurich University of the Arts. His book Dirigierende Maschinen, Musik mit technikgestützter Tempovermittlung, Conducting Machines, Music with Technology-Assisted Tempo Mediation, has recently been published by Transcript in Bielefeld. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
So, today we would like to open a conversation about tempo and time in music. We know that both of your research and even like your PhD focus research was on polytempo relationships. Is something that we also work with as composers. I came to know Dr. Marc Yeats' work through looking for alternative music notations and polytempo structures. And Tobias, you also have some connection with the work of Philippe.
Yes, exactly. And both Itza and I are also in the research residency at the ICST, and that's how we explored the software system by Philippe. And let's dive into it. Can you maybe, Marc, explain a little bit what was your initial contact to polytempo composition, asynchronicity, and what's your idea behind that?
Well, I think initially it goes back to childhood and to sort of not necessarily visions, but let's say I used to imagine sound that was like masses of birds flying around, where each bird was doing its own thing, but doing it in a kind of coordinated mass of discoordinated entities. And I have spent from now until then trying to get close to realizing some of those ideas musically.
Mm-hmm.
And that has taken me on a journey, and it has resulted in my PhD research, which I suppose is really where I tried to find a proof of concept that my ideas would work. So how long have I been involved doing this? It feels like a lifetime, really. But I think when it comes to putting dots on paper to actually express those ideas, I would say probably about 15 years, with the greatest activity in the last 7 or 8 years.
That's fascinating. How about you, Philippe?
Well, in a very strict sense, I've been working with tempo polyphony for about 10 years, 12 years. But in my case as well, it goes back to my early musical development somehow. I was very early in my musical development interested in polyphony. That was always fascinating for me. And when I mean polyphony, what fascinated me was this music that moves along in parallel strands that are at the same time independent but still interrelated. That has a great fascination for me. And then, very important, I learned from studying the music of Elliott Carter that the temporal aspects of music, so rhythm and especially tempo, can also contribute to the independency of polyphonic voices. So what you can find very often in Carter's music, that he characterizes single instruments in a polyphonic texture by several musical features, among which you can find tempo as well. Yeah, and that's how I came to tempo polyphony.
That is absolutely fascinating. And I mean, I don't want to like start so soon with like the heavy existential questions, but I think one very interesting question would be to ask you, how would you define tempo polyphony? I know that, Marc, in your doctoral dissertation, you have like a whole section where you talk about the differences between polymetry, polytempo, polytactus. And I think that maybe just trying to very briefly like draw the boundaries around what tempo polyphony can be and what it means for you in your work, maybe an interesting way to
Sure. Well, I mean, there's an awful lot to say on it, and there are some people who have written books on it. I am not one of those people. I think I tend to try and find the easiest solutions to things, so I can just get on and make music. And for me, the distinction that came between polytactic and polytemporal music was very much borrowed from research of somebody else whose name is Randall, who made the distinction that pulse tempo, in its simplest expression, is where you have a piece of music, let's say an orchestral piece of music that is conducted, where the conductor is going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the players, and this I think is a case in a lot of what happens in Carter's music as well, the players are playing at different pulse tempo speeds within that. So you've got two things going on at once. You've got a sort of an invisible felt metric framework, which is what the conductor is delivering. And within that, each performer or each group of performers are working to pulse streams, which is the beat that you're going to hear, which is contrary to what the conductor is doing. And these different layers all synchronize together create this polyphony of polymetric entities. Now, in polytemporal music, each line or each group of music will have its own independently defined tempo through a metronome mark. So instead of having one overriding global beat that's going on, which everybody then is finding their way against or through, in polytemporal music, by the distinction that Randall set up, each of the players are playing to an independent simultaneous tempo. So there are lots of implications about how you conceive music, how you notate music, and how you perform music under those circumstances. Because if you're a performer performing in a polytactic work, you're having to feel, on the one hand, a conceptual metered time frame along with the time signatures, but what you're playing can be completely different to that. Whereas in polytempo music, there is a greater coincidence potentially between the tempo that is expressed and the playing that you're doing. There are issues and problems about coordination and synchronization, which I'm sure we'll all come on to. But for me, the distinction is if you've got a score that is performed with global tempo markings, but there are lots of different pulse streams of activity going on, that is a polytactus, many beats going on, many pulses. And if you have a score or a piece of music where you have multiple independent simultaneous metronome marks, that is polytemporal. There were people that would disagree with that. There are people that would split hairs, but that's my working definition.
Yeah, I think you highlight a network of questions on different layers and levels of complexity and interactivity. And also what I hear from your response is some sense of a technological aspect to it. And I think, Philippe, you have developed
Yeah, I would like to comment on that, because I also in my research try to differentiate different types of tempo polyphony, and what Marc just explained sounds extremely familiar to me, because I'm came to a very similar conclusion. I use slightly different words, so thank you for the polytactic idea. What you call polytactic, so there is one, what sometimes in literature is called a reference tempo. That's the tempo the conductor beats, or if it is a chamber music ensemble, the musicians feel and coordinate to each other. If this is the case, I call it a notation-based tempo polyphony. That would be my term for that, because the way these different pulse streams are expressed is by means of note values, of a clever way of using note values and polyrhythms and so on. So that's for me notation-based. It is it guarantees synchronicity, but it's not a real tempo polyphony. And when it comes to real tempo polyphony, where every musician has an independent individual tempo indicated by a metronome mark, there I make a distinction between free and controlled tempo polyphony. So free tempo polyphony, or just mere stratification, as you can find in Charles Ives' music, for instance, there you have independent tempos. There is no global shared tempo, but there is no such a thing as precise coordination. That's not that's nothing bad. It's not necessary for this kind of music to be 100% precise and in a very contrapuntal way that you can, as a composer, write this note comes exactly at the same time with another note. So that's free tempo polyphony or stratification, and the other one would be controlled tempo polyphony. But then, and that's a very important point for my research, you need technological aids. You need a click track or something, because that's not, well, on a certain degree of complexity, it's not possible for human musicians to stay precise in time in such a kind of tempo polyphony. So that would be.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
can I?
Please.
Now that is a good starting point for a major decision that I made. I wanted to be able to write an independent temporal trajectory for every single instrument of the orchestra, all 90 or 100 or what have you of them. And whilst I did explore the technological aspect to that, I realized that on a practical basis, wiring up 100 musicians to a click track or 100 different click tracks, all organized through some central computer with thousands of wires everywhere, hours of preparation, it was dead in the water. Nobody would touch it with a barge pole and nobody was interested. So my technical solution to creating polytemporal orchestral music, which is what my research was about, was a kind of reaction to technology, against technology. And that's why I ended up using timecode and mobile phones and the mobile phone stop clock, because what you're saying about not being able to gain absolute precision is completely true. But I've actually embraced the notion of the generation of flux, because of the way you cannot calculate the alignment of exact detail. But what I have termed sonic flux is all the detail that is generated by the interpretive aspect of human performance. But I use the time code to act as a confinement so that the overarching structural shape of the piece can be maintained while as the localized detail may fluctuate within that. And I consider that to be a quid pro quo for losing the certain aspects of pre-planned definition to create non-pre-planned or indeterminate definition that arises out of the act of human performance, by approaching it from as musician-friendly a way as I could. And as far as I'm concerned, it works. But I'm not in the business of creating that absolute precise alignment of things, because I cannot do it. As you say, Philippe, it's impossible to do it without having that extra brain, that external brain organizing things, i.e. some form of technology.
I mean, I think that is a very, very good point, and I'm very happy that we've arrived to this two different strategies to work with very similar polytemporal objectives. I mean, we can talk about aesthetics once we hear some of your music, but something that I would really like to point out that I'm hearing from both of you is that still, even when you use a computer or when you use a smartphone with a stopwatch, you're using technology.
Yeah.
And that is something very interesting. I know Don Aide says like technology with capital T is whatever the society decides that is high technological advancement. And today that may be digital technologies or a computer, but in that sense, a pencil, a piece of paper, a paper score is also a technology. And especially in the sense of the stopwatch and having just a clock, this is also like a technological abstraction of some embodied sense of time passing that we have to read in that sense. So it's also like another layer of technological reading that the musicians need to do. We're just more used to it because we use clocks all the time.
Yeah.
How about we dive into some music examples? And I know that you prepared some of your research and creative works. Would that make sense? Maybe Marc, could you show us some music?
Yes.
Please?
I have to press the technological buttons now.
Absolutely.
And hope that this works.
Paper is not allowed right now.
No. Okay. So you can still hear me? Yes. Okay. Shall I just play? I have 4 extracts here, each of which is around a minute to a minute and 10 seconds. So shall I play all 4 and just talk a little bit in between them? Is that acceptable, or do you want me to stop in between, or?
Both okay. So maybe just get started, and then
Okay.
If you have questions, we will interrupt you.
I would be
Okay.
interested to hear actually something with orchestra. That would be amazing.
Okay. Well, I will start with that then.
Okay.
Although I must say that I wrote a big orchestral 20-minute orchestral piece where all players were independent for the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, but unfortunately the pandemic came along and they couldn't do it. It's been postponed. It will be done in the not too distant future. But they approached me again to ask me to write a piece for 22 players, because they could spatially put those in the concert hall with enough distance around them for it to meet the lockdown regulations. So this is an extract of that piece that I shall play. So this is 22 players, not the 90 that, So here we go. Stop. Right. Just something that I wanted to say about that. This piece became part of my PhD research. It was one of my proof of the pudding pieces. And what I had done was, when I created my compositional model, I created a model in Logic Pro, which used sound samples, which were exactly synchronized from the notation into the audio, and then the audio was synchronized. So I had a model which it was mathematically perfect, if you like. And to see how my timecode supported method worked with an orchestra, I very, very simply, nothing technical, but I took the acoustic recording, this recording, and sat it on top of the computer generated recording and measured the discrepancies. And nowhere was it any more than 1 second out, which is actually incredibly impressive for music of this kind of virtuosity and complexity. So for me, that sort of proved the point that it works, and also that the musicians really enjoyed doing it, because there's no conductor and there's no score. Everything is in the parts, so nobody knows conceptually what the music is until it's actually sound. So that's an interesting point. Do you have any questions about that before I move on to the next piece?
Yeah, I just thought especially like how the trumpet kept its trajectory as opposed to the percussion and the strings. That was very palpable as a polytempo music and successful in that sense. I really enjoyed it. I'm waiting for the orchestra piece.
I have a question. Which orchestra was playing and how many musicians were on?
Yeah, that was the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. And in this was 22 players.
22.
The next time it will be the full triple wind orchestra, 4 horns, the whole shebang, the big one, and the piece would be 20 minutes long. This piece is 12 minutes long. But there are links to the full recording of this as well. What was I going to say? I can't remember. Did I answer both those questions?
I have one question. When you say the triple wind, have you also considered that there would be some group within the orchestra that has the same tempo layer? Or are they always disconnected in
right.
the same way?
Yeah, at the moment, in the works that I've done previously, my ambition was to be able to combine heterogeneous materials, temporally heterogeneous materials. In other words, materials that weren't linked through any kind of ratios, which were simple and clear sort of proportions. This is because it reflects the way I compose, which is to do with self-borrowing and transforming my own materials, and this generates lots of materials with very individual and varied temporal profiles, and I wanted to layer those all together whilst maintaining those profiles. In new developments that are coming, I am looking at mixing and matching all sorts of different things to do with synchronicity and polytemporal and blah blah blah. So, but in this piece, no, and in none of the pieces I'm going to play is that the case. I'm going to go down in scale now. The next piece is an E-flat clarinet concerto style piece, and this is also time code supported polytemporal, and this is also a performance which very much mirrored the compositional model that I set up.
Fantastic.
Really, really beautiful music. Before we continue, Marc, I just want to make a quick comment to everyone who's joining us today. You can send your questions through the chat, and we will read them out loud at the end of the talk. Meanwhile, if you happen to have any questions, comments, existential questions as well are welcome. And yeah, thank you.
Marc, could we maybe have another example or some visual representation of what we just heard?
Nope. There is no visual representation because there is no score.
Yeah.
The notational, there is no notation software that I have access to which can even begin to correlate these different temporal lines in a particular fixed way. And even if it did, what you were going to be hearing wouldn't necessarily be what's represented in that way. So there isn't a correlation that's directly notational that I can share with you.
Marc, now you're touching a very, very important point in tempo polyphony, namely the problem that there can't be a real score because, as you said, no notation program facilitates writing in different tempo strands. And I think that's a very a crucial question and also part of my research. And can you elaborate on that? How is your working process when you don't have the score anymore, where you can lay things out and see all the relations on your manuscript paper?
Yeah,
That requires different compositional strategies.
absolutely. It most certainly does. I mean, I have written score-based orchestral works, synchronized works, and as you rightly say, this is going into a completely different territory. I developed a method whereby I like to surprise myself by my own compositions. I like there to be a large range of unpredictable relationships or relationships that I couldn't foresee that I can then determine and keep as being my own. And I do this by combining these heterogeneous self borrowed transformed materials. But the process that I use is in some ways quite simple. I use Sibelius software for my notation. I then use the playback of Sibelius to create a sound file, which is set in its tempo profile. And I do this with all the different lines, all the different fragments that I want. And then I import all of those audio samples into Logic. And then I create the structure by locating those layers one on top of the other, moving them around, eroding them, changing them, adding new materials until I develop a structure, musical structure that I want. I have no idea where I'm going when I start, and I only know when I've finished when I have finished. But you know, it's a sort of very flexible process. But I work primarily with the notion of the sound. But I do that equally understanding that what I will get in performance is not what's on the computer. So the computer is there to give me, let's say, the broadest building blocks, because I do not have the conceptual notion of how sound is organized vertically that you can get from score notation. So I actually have to work with another substitute. So the substitute that I'm using to conceptualize the piece are sound samples, sound files from lines of music that then all play back simultaneously in Logic, because it's just playing samples. What's in them doesn't matter, it's just playing them. And of course the time code is automatically part of the Logic playback because it's playing back in seconds and fractions of seconds. So I can see exactly where things start, where they finish, and how they line up. So there is a sort of, I suppose you could think of those sound files as acting like placeholders of sonic content, but they're not the real thing. They are they too are a model, a conceptual model.
It almost reminds me of the work that you would do when you do a sculpture with those modules, right? Adding material, shaving off material, and modifying the overall construction, so to say.
And that process is also something that's very familiar to me from painting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Because a lot of what I do when I paint is I put layers on, I let them dry, I put other layers on, and then I put other layers on, and then I scrape away, and then I put more layers, and I glaze. And it's this sort of recursive assimilative process of adding lots and lots of different layers that once you start mining into them and removing them, start to create relationships between materials. And I'm very much a believer in that if you put almost any two things together in context, the human mind will forge relationships. Mm-hmm. So I am not concerned about the I can't ever say the word homogeneity. The togetherness of things. All my materials do not have to be derived from the same atoms. They can be taken from different sources. I put them together. I work on the basis that because I have generated all those materials at some point, because they are all transformed replications of themselves, because they all share a kind of DNA, that however I combine them, A, it will have my stamp on them, and two, it will provide relationships I hadn't conceived previously.
Mm-hmm.
Can we maybe listen to one more
Okay.
sound example, please?
I'm going to give you a vocal one here. This is an interesting one. This was auditive vocal in Dresden. Singers all have pretty much perfect pitch, and they have little tuning forks which before they start they kind of get their pitching, and sometimes between. And this piece of music was constructed from a sort of canonic point of view, where the canons changed tempo as they went through the material, but they were layered in different ways. So you may well hear that. You might not. I'm not sure how much of that will come across. But this piece did not use time code. This piece was using the facility of the musicians to interpret metronome markings themselves, and that's an interesting proposition, because such things vary. But here we go.
Very polyphonic.
Yes.
You can sense the canon aspect of it. It's really fascinating, but it's not like that strict canonic construction. It's like very flexible. It's really wonderful.
Thank you.
May I ask? Usually, maybe it works different for voice pieces than for orchestral pieces. But usually, what is your range of tempo? Polyphony, like what is your lowest tempo that you usually employ, and the highest, like the fastest?
Well, sometimes when I'm writing for orchestral players, I tend to keep the way I express tempo within certain notational bounds. For instance, I'm unlikely to do quaver 28 for an orchestra. I might do that for a soloist. When it comes to creating ensemble works where I have a group of specialist contemporary music performers, then my tempo may well range from really quite low, I would say probably 30, up to 210 sometimes, something like that. With orchestral players, I would tend to change the notation rather than the tempo, because I think there are difficulties if you've got a lot of people together in counting 1, 2, because it's so slow. So I would probably subdivide and do it that way. But there's quite a big point of difference. But the point that I make with that is that I would never be looking at metronome tempo markings which have a direct divisible relationship one to the other, not because I have anything against them, I don't. It's just because when I'm writing my materials to start off with, they have their own identity, and that identity does not exist in relation to anything else. So if I'm then combining those materials with other things, they bring that identity with them, and I don't necessarily moderate that. That's my characterization, as opposed to Carter's characterization, which is a somewhat different. But anyway, there we go.
Yeah, I mean, I want to hear a little bit more about how you diverge from Carter's sense of identity. Identity in terms of musical material.
Well, I mean, I am no Carter expert, and I'm sure that Philippe knows considerably more about Carter than I do. But what I would say from a very surface observation is, firstly, that the music that I write is different because, as opposed to Carter tends to have, let's call them sort of temporal groups within orchestral pieces that he plays off one and off the other, and those temporal groups would have different subdivisions of various pulses within them, as opposed to where my approach to creating orchestral music, concerto, or whatever, is that each player has an independent tempo, and that is the major difference between what I write and pieces like Gruppen and what have you. They are dealing with groups of polytemporal distinction. I'm looking at individual players. The characterization comes with the material, and it comes with the tempo identification of that material. And that's going to work in the same way as if you have a piece of music with 5 characterized groups in it, or 5 characterized soloists. But of course, when you've got 50 characterized soloists, you go into different territory. And that territory for me includes obfuscation of the actual nature of polytemporality, where you transition from what the ear can perceive, which is actually not a great deal, into the realms of texture. And I'm very interested in moving from texture to clarity and from obfuscation to clarity. And I would say that the entire narrative of my music, if you could describe it as a narrative, is to do with the journeying between densities and that the characterization of those densities, whether they're to do with tessitura, volume, mass, all of those things.
Thank you, Marc. That was very interesting and insightful. I think we should now give the stage to Philippe and hear a bit more about Philippe's method and his composition. Philippe, what do you have to show?
I have prepared 2 examples, two pieces of mine that I would like to share with you. I think first of all I would like to start with a statement. I would describe myself as a composer/programmer. So as a programmer, of course, I develop my tempo polyphony software that facilitates the synchronization of the musicians and so on. But I work also as a programmer in my artistic work, as I'm very much into computer-assisted composition, algorithmic composition, and so on. So I make no differentiation between composing and programming. They are both parts of the creative work. That's 2 sides of the same coin. I think that's very important. I probably can talk about my polytempo software a bit later. For now, I would like to talk about my musical thinking. And as I'm doing artistic research, my compositional work is always kind of research question driven. And I think I have 2 main questions for my polytemporal works. The first is, how can tempo be or become an essential compositional parameter? And when I say essential, I mean the same as harmony and melody in tonal music. And once tempo is an essential parameter, this entails tempo polyphony as well, of course. And the second question is, how is this essential nature of tempo perceivable for the listener? Or put differently, how is tempo polyphony perceivable at all? I mean, if your music doesn't really transport on its surface a feeling of a pulse, then how can you tell there is something like tempo polyphony and not just a very complicated, so to speak, new music rhythm type? And I came to the conclusion there are several effects combined with tempo polyphony. So let me explain this with two compositions of mine. So now I have to do the technical things, share screen, switch on sound, and there we go. The first one is a saxophone quartet, a quartet for 4 soprano saxophones. So you see, I chose a completely homogeneous instrumentation in order to find out how I can bring out stratification just by means of tempo and not by differentiation of timbre and instrumentation. And that's one page of the score. And as you can see, the tempo changes all the time. There are probably only 2 or 3 bars in the whole piece where the tempo is actually constant. And apart from these 2 or 3 bars, the tempo is speeding up, slowing down individually for each instrument all the time. So I really try to make the tempo a malleable parameter of the music. On the other hand, the notation is quite simple. That was also a deliberate choice because I wanted to put the whole rhythmical complexity to tempo and not to the musical, not to note values and the rhythmic the texture. So everything, it never gets more complex than on this page. Everything is in this realm of semiquavers. No quintuplets and stuff. It's like this. This is a graphical representation how the tempos change. You see they are moving up and down all the time. Each color is one instrument. And still you can see ever so often there are these coordination points, these coincidences where the tempo, the direction of the tempo change is coordinated in all instruments. And I used these coordination points also for my composition, as these are the points where something changes. For instance, there is a change in harmony, or a change in texture, or a change in loudness, whatever. So I try to get this feeling of freedom, which you can perceive because all the instruments are playing in this ever-changing tempos, but at the same time there is a structure. There are certain things that are coordinated. So it's freedom, synchronicity and asynchronicity at the same time. And the secondary idea was to different spatial perspectives on the same music. So this piece has 4 movements, 4 parts, and they are quite similar. They share a great deal of material, but the musicians, they change back and forth between 2 playing positions. So one is they are all on stage in the traditional way, frontal, and the second playing position is they are spread out around the audience, which gives two different impressions to the audience in terms of, it's all about the psychoacoustic effects of stream segregation and being able to hear polyphony better if the sound sources come from different directions and so on. Yeah, and because of the fact that the musicians are sometimes on stage and sometimes around the audience, that's where the title comes from, hier und dort, which means in English here and there. And yeah, let's listen to a very short excerpt. It's just 1 minute, and Tobias, you got my email that I sent you just before we met with so probably you could put this in the chat.
Yeah.
So for everyone who wants to listen more can do so on my website, where there is
Sure.
yeah, everything. You can listen to a longer excerpt of the whole piece. So let's go. That was the first example. Are there questions right on?
I have a couple of questions. One is, are the performers there in that surrounding the audience configuration, or are they?
Yeah, that was one part of the piece where the musicians are spread out around the audience. That's right.
And the other question is a question similar that I made to Marc. What is your range of tempo usually when you work? I saw like very, very low tempo marking.
Well, there is no. Are you seeing in this one? It's going between, for this piece, going between 60 and 100.
Okay.
So not very drastic.
No, I'm not 40. 40 is the lowest.
And this diagram you have up here looks like a sort of palindromic inversion.
Yeah.
Is it?
A nice observation.
Kind of, yes. I tried. I made this up from very simple numbers in order to ensure that I get every 2 bars this synchronization point.
Yeah.
So to make all the numbers and all the mathematics behind it work, I had to choose very simple numbers and a very simple structure of going symmetrically up and down.
Sure. The other question was, in that performance, how were the musicians actually getting their tempi exactly? Did they have click tracks, or were they just...
They had a kind of click track. Hang on, I have... Probably that's now the point where I have to briefly talk about my my software. So what they have is, they have in front of them a computer screen where they see their music as well as a visual tempo indication. And each musician has one computer and they are all connected in a local network. So when one is started, all the others follow in perfect sync. And you can also you can also listen to a click track if you want. Some musicians prefer a click track, as I found out, especially percussionists. They feel more comfortable with a click track than with this visual conducting. But all other musicians, especially those with orchestra experience, they really like this kind of visual tempo indication.
And just out of interest,
that's
oops.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, how many players have you networked at any one time using this technology?
I think the maximum was about 15. So let's say 8 musicians on stage and an electronic playback and 15. But I think there is no restriction as long as you have a network connection that allows for a certain number of clients.
Yes.
And one more question to the piece. So the material that the saxophones are playing is so similar, as you said, that in the process of the tempi crossing each other, there is always that moment, as I perceived it, of almost non-polytempo that then again splits the part into polytempo and vice versa. Was that part of your idea?
Not in this sense as you describe it right now. The initial idea was this tempo structure with tempos moving up and down between 40 and 120. And of course, when they cross, there is a short moment of synchronicity. But one amazing effect that you can't have on headphones is in the concert space when they were the musicians were placed around the audience, where you could really hear how it goes up and down differently and coming from different directions. That was quite amazing and quite effective. And like this, all the musicians on stage, or we listen to it in a stereo version, everything is at the same place. It's more kind of a texture. But that was also part of the idea, to hear first a texture of these notes moving, and then in the next part hear the same texture but with the musicians placed in space, and the opportunity to really perceive all the individual tempo layers.
Mm-hmm. Great. I have an audience question that's in fact one of my students, Daniel, asks, what were some of the challenges you faced when building the software powering this? Were there any technical limitations that you had to work around? Thank you for the question. That's a very interesting question.
I first had to come up with this how to indicate the tempo, and then I came up with this conductor. That is not really a problem I faced, but that was certainly one important point. And then I think one of the biggest issue a couple of years ago was when we went from a wired network to a wireless network, because then we had to implement, when I say we, it's not the royal we, it's I have a programmer who helps me doing some of the stuff. So we had to face the problem of latency correction, because since then you can have them in a wireless network with any amount of latency, which results in when you hit start, it probably starts not right on, but with a delay of half a second, whatever, but all the instruments in sync.
Could we maybe hear another music extract, Philippe, please?
Yeah. Let me share my screen again. The next piece is called Tempo Studie, Tempo Study. And that one is not about perceiving the tempos going up and down. It's about how tempo and synchronicity can be an important part of the compositional structure. It's a trio for violin, bass, clarinet, and accordion, and it consists of 24 short fragments. There are 8 fragments per instrument. All the fragments have an identical length of 6 bars. And these fragments are arranged in a random order by a computer algorithm at the moment of performance. So it's an open form piece. And it's not only the order of these fragments that is random generated, it's also the tempo. As you can see on the lower half of my slide, this tempo arrangement, some of these fragments are extended, others are condensed, so they have to be played in different tempos as an effect. And that is also something I find very interesting in terms of how can tempo become a compositional parameter, to have the same material being played in different tempos. I used this for several other compositions as well. And here in this composition, it's quite a broad range. It goes from 36 to 120. So the musicians have to practice all these fragments in a way that they can play it very slow and very fast. And the interesting part is they change their expressive quality. It's the same music, but if it is played very slow, like tempo 30, or very fast, it's a completely different kind of expression. In a very general sense, if it is fast, it comes more to the foreground because there is more activity, and if it is very slow, it moves to the background and becomes more like an accompaniment layer. But I think that's I find it interesting to do this with the same written material. So that's also something which is included in that piece. And that's how it is done technically. So there is, you see on top, there is one fragment, 6 bars, and each fragment has 4 what I call synchronization points within these 6 bars where something happens. So of course, the beginning, an instrument starts to play, the end, an instrument stops, and 2 points in between where there is a change in dynamics or a change in pitch range. So a perceivable change. And now these fragments are put on a random time grid in a way that these synchronization points fall on this grid to be synchronized with an synchronization point of another instrument. So not always, but very often when something happens in one instrument, something happens in another instrument at the same time as well. And that's what I believe gives the, so to speak, the musical meaning to this music. It has to be like this. And since there is not one tempo for the whole 6 bars, I have to calculate a tempo curve that goes up and down exactly in that way that these 4 synchronization points are met. it's a bit of mathematics that goes into that.
And a brief question here, the tempo curve, meaning it can also be a bent trajectory. It must not be a linear tempo process. Is that correct?
It is not linear. It's linear on this diagram just for the sake of simplicity, because sometimes you need a slight at the top of this tempo curve. That's not just this peak. There is of course a curved going faster and slowing down again. That's calculated. That's the mathematical formalism that I use creates curves and not this linear kind. But that's here linear just for the sake of simple explanation.
You have an audio example of this, right?
Yeah.
Great.
That was one performance, one rendition. You see, it's the rendition of the 6th December 2019. And for this concert, we played it several times in a row. One run through is about 2.5 minutes. We played it several times in a row to allow for the audience to get slight idea of this piece being an open form piece, the same material reoccurring several times in different arrangings and so on. And for one of the last repeats of this piece, I decided to go for a bit pedagogical approach, and I projected the random form to reveal some of my magic to the audience.
Thank you so much for sharing that extract. We remind the audience that there is a link to Philippe Kocher's works that you can go to visit in your own time. And we will be publishing also a link to Marc's website so that you can keep listening to this great music. And I would like to open a question for both of you. Now, seeing also the video of Philippe's performance and how the same musical material has different qualities once the tempo is transformed. And that also has an effect in terms of corporeality of performance. And it's something that I know I have encountered in my work with polytempo, and I know that Tobias has as well. I had this piece for percussion quartet where I worked with Afro-Latin rhythms, and I had one guiro scrape in tempo 11. So that super slow sound was almost like granular because it was so slow, like every ridge had like 3 seconds of separation in between them. So I want to ask you both, what is your experience in terms of embodiment of your music when working with performers?
Shall I kick off?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, as I said originally, because I transform my own materials over and over and over again, and tempo transformations are very much part of that. And it is interesting how my personal response to materials changes depending on their tempo as singular units, but also when those materials are combined with other materials, the context of it changes yet again. So I think that there are a number of factors within performance, and I can't speak for performers, because I think one of the things that one learns about performance and about anything in music is that there is a large degree of shared authorship, and as such the interpretation, the hermeneutics of the performer on any given day will be XYZ, on any other given day will be something else. But I do think that one of the things that fascinates me is the endless variety of interpretive expression that comes from different kinds of musicians, from different backgrounds, and playing in different contexts. In orchestras, for instance, and large ensembles, where players are used to having an artistic director or a conductor, and where they are used to, in some senses, passing over elements of their own personal interpretation to somebody else to create a body of sound made of lots of composite people. Whereas with the stuff that I'm giving them, they are very much in charge of what they're doing themselves, right through from balance to expression and all sorts of other elements. So I think that the ever changing environment within which these sounds produced creates an interpretive reality. The sound, the sonic fact of what you put across is related to the tempo, definitely. And I know that because I use the same materials at different speeds at different times in different parts of the piece of music, and they feel contextually and perceptually very different, although materially they are not actually, it's dots on a page that are being played slower or faster. Everything that's being contributed to those dots on the page is from the human being. It is interpretation, it is perception. And there are probably ways that one could study that through psychoacoustics or whatever, I don't know. But from a listener and from a creator point of view, my own sense of embodiment when I'm imagining sound, when I'm working with sound, is altered by tempo. And I have every reason to suspect from the differing kinds of reactions of musicians and of audiences that their interpretation and their own embodiment of sound is equally as diverse. So,
how about you, Philippe?
Yeah, when I first performed this last piece I showed, this tempo studio with the different tempos randomly generated, I had an ensemble with musicians that are very much into improvisation. So they found it extremely exciting to have this material prepared and then being within a split second, being confronted with any tempo between 30 and 120, and then to play the material in that tempo. That really addressed them as improvisers more than just interpreters or performers. That's one point. And I have one other thought that's probably, that's a different aspect of corporality of tempo. And that's related to my question, what are the effects of tempo polyphony? Of course, there are some temporal effects for the audience. And there is one thing, and that's the visual appearance of the ensemble on stage. How they, I would call it the stage effect of tempo polyphony. Because the musicians, they stop, let me put it very in a negative way, they stop communicating. Because they can't move, can't express bodily movements in that somehow conveys the tempo, because there is no common tempo. So everyone is very static, and they don't give cues because that wouldn't make sense for other musicians because they play in different tempos. And they, of course, and they have my screen conducting and so on. So, and now I try to turn it the other way around and formulate it in a positive way. There is this extreme sense of concentration. There is no unnecessary movement apart from those movements that are necessary to operate your instrument. There is no waving and giving cues and trying to synchronize in a tempo, which you sometimes can see, especially in contemporary music, where it is that the rhythm, the rhythmic structure is extremely complex. There has to be one member of the ensemble somehow acting as a conductor. There is a lot of movement going on. And then with a tempo polyphony, because there is no sense for making these movements, there is this extreme concentration. Some people call it an alienation because they stop communicating, but I find it extremely fascinating, this immobile concentration on stage.
Yeah.
So that's also
Yeah, it's almost like there's a new mode of musicianship emerging from this changed state of interactivity on stage, which is virtual rather than embodied or symbolic. And I think that's a very good quality of the polytempo music, although some musicians always would say that something is missing, but yeah.
Yes, no, rather people from the audience say, oh, I hate looking at them because they're just standing there in front. Are they making music together or what? But from the perspective of musicians, I got to a very high percentage. I got very positive feedback. There was, in all these years, I've been using this software and doing polytempo music. There was just one performer, an elderly musician, who said, no, that's not why I became a musician in the first place. That's not how I want to make music. But
that's okay. Yeah.
That's okay. No, I don't mind. But in most cases, the musicians liked it, and at one of the polytempo concerts a couple of years ago, after the concert, the flutist came to me and said, you know, I never felt this kind of freedom when playing contemporary music, because normally you have to pay attention to cues and react and who is giving which cue and so on. And with this polytempo system, they could just come and play to the conductor and everything falls in place effortlessly. So, and she really said, that's so much freedom. I can really concentrate on my playing and don't have to pay attention to a conductor or to my fellow musicians.
Right. I mean, I would. Oh, please, Mark.
I just wanted to pick up on this bodily movement during performance aspect, because just as an aside, the clarinetist who played in the Shapeshifter piece, Gleb Kamenovich, he did his doctoral thesis on part of it was to do with the physicality necessary to produce the sounds that I make because of the kind of virtuosic writing. And the video I have posted, you have a link for a video of this, and he dances his way through the performance. Now, he's not dancing in the time that other people are dancing. There's no foot tapping with everybody, as Philippe says. You don't have that kind of, let's go with the beat. But I would say that it also depends on the, what's the word I'm looking for? And the physicality of the production of sound to produce the music, which is inherent in the making of the sound. And in the music, even in the orchestra, there were players who, the flute player will be doing this, the violin player is doing that, the pianist is going, and it's not because they're conducting, it's not because they're queuing. It's because part of what I said to them before they began playing was, you are not playing on your own. You are playing among other people, and you are creating a corporate sound. And when you play, I would invite you to respond to the context within which you are playing in that moment. I'm not offering some kind of total serialism here. It is about a highly expressive environment. So do move into the music, go a little bit faster or a little bit slower, or whatever takes you in that moment of time, and giving people license to be expressive. And that translates into physicality. So I have found that luckily there isn't that kind of static aspect. There's quite a lot of generated physical activity, which I think people who watch that tend to kind of be drawn in as well, because as Philippe says, it can be quite isolating if you see people kind of, they are so restricted in themselves, no matter what sound's coming out. So that was my little contribution to the movement bit, the physicality bit.
It's really fascinating, and I would say that one reason why I find polytempo music so incredibly, I don't know, I feel it very deeply in my being, because, for example, one system that calculates latencies and that allows people to be together is what we are now in, that is Zoom. Yeah. So togetherness in 2023 with new technologies has different meanings, and this challenging to what it means to be together, even though we are geographically apart in different time zones, yet we are here right now, although our right now is a different time for each of us. And that feels very polytempo to me in aesthetic and philosophical terms as well.
Yeah.
And here's a comment by Sylvia Hinz, not a question, a comment. Hello, I'm one of those musicians who premiered Marc's pieces, and I really love it. Yes, it's different, but still a complete ensemble sensation, because you share the same musical space and idea and sounds. Thank you, Sylvia. That's fantastic.
Hello, Sylvia.
Yeah. and I have a question regarding the modular nature of the compositions. Philippe, you have the modular composition that is generated in modular form, and as I got from you, Marc, your composition uses modular material in different situations. So the question would be like similar to visual generative art, where like the code is producing each time a different rendition. Do you feel that all those different renditions make up of the identity of the piece, or do you, as it happens, have a favorite version of a piece that was just performed in a specific order? Maybe Philippe, you go first.
If there is a better and better versions of the piece, well, two things. I have this modular thinking, even when I write music that is in the end in a fixed score. So it was a very natural step to open this up, because you have to make decisions which part, how to combine all these parts. And at some point, I came to the conclusion: why do I have to make these decisions when there are equally valid versions of the same, or equally valid combinations of the material? So I could just delegate this to a random algorithm and just focus on the. I mean, this random algorithm, let me put it like this: this random algorithm is not completely free. There are several constraints. There is a huge field of possibilities, but they are still, the possibilities are limited. It has to meet this synchronization points and so on. So it stays within a confined aesthetic aesthetic field, so to speak. And I really like to formulate a grammar, how a piece can come to existence within these rule set, and not to make all the decisions until the very end. And yeah, and when again, this tempo studie that I showed, that of course at the beginning it was just an abstract idea, and I realized it, and I was, how to say, something between excited but also frightened how good it worked every time. There was every time kind of meaningful music. And I thought, well, that's fascinating. I'm so unimportant as a composer to make all the decisions until the very end. I just can leave some of the decisions open and it works.
I would just add that I tend to believe that all performances are iterative, synchronized or otherwise. If you've got humans involved, they're going to be iterative, and they will have indeterminacies attached to them. It's just the scope of those indeterminacies and how open they actually are. In my own music, I mentioned this thing that I call sonic flux, which is to do with where things are not precisely aligned, and each performance will offer a slightly different combination of those elements on a local level. As the piece unfolds structurally, it should maintain a recognizable structure. But I think that when I looking at Philippe's piece, when he's got the little boxes with material lined up, and I'm thinking, well, actually, there is very little difference between what he and I are doing in many respects, except that I am not as concerned with the synchronization element of it, I would say. But the stretching the material, making material shorter, having coordination points. I put my coordination points into scores by saying, come in at this point with so-and-so, even though there's time code running, and someone will take charge. So I have a more manual approach to doing it. But the kind of, if I showed you pictures of my Logic arrange page where I have one of my models, it looks surprisingly like the setup that you had for Here and There, or that's, no, that's the wrong piece. The other
one, tempo study. Yeah.
Yes. So I think I embrace difference, and I embrace the difference of performances. Anything which judges whether one performance is better than the other, I think, is a purely subjective, emotional opinion. It is not a fact. It's just a choice. And as Philippe was saying, I don't necessarily make all the right choices about what the best performance should be, because there are other options. And if some of those options are surrendered to a machine or technology to sort out, that's absolutely fine. I leave quite a lot of the decisions to human beings to make as they're playing their music. So there are similarities, and I love flux, and I love iteration. So I think one reason why Beethoven's Piano Sonata Number 21 has 350,000 million recordings is because of the iterative nature of performance per se.
Because they all sound the same.
Yeah, exactly.
But
and some of them unfortunately do.
If you have that Logic Pro screenshot available, it would be great to see it. And I think Itza has a last question before we close our meeting for today.
Yes,
okay.
We are running out of time. And do we have another question?
And I think we have another.
Two
more questions
so
from the Q&A.
The last question. One thing I would say is that you have like these connections and similarities in thinking through polytempo music, but also like it's very interesting to see the range of musicians that you write for. So Marc, you write like these orchestral pieces, and with Philippe, we saw more like chamber music, up to 15 performers with electronics, and that is, for me as a composer, is pretty cool, because then I know that we have all of this range of two performers, one performer to 60 performers, and that we can still do polytempo music, and that is very inspiring. So I'm going to read Josh Perry's question. First off, many thanks for this great presentation. A question for Marc. Could you please explain more what the musicians performing your music see on their smartphones? Is it a stopwatch at different speeds, or is it showing the beat pulses of their part?
Okay, it is really, really very, very simple. Every bar of the music has a time code marking printed above it, which is determined by the tempo marking, the metronome marking. And the mobile phone is just a simple stopwatch. That's all it does. It runs in seconds and minutes and hours. And the way it works is that at the beginning of the performance, leader of the orchestra or whoever will stand up and go 1, 2, 3, 4, push, and everybody pushes a stopwatch on their mobile phone. Then there's about 12 seconds where nothing happens, so people can just settle down. And then the piece begins at time code mark, whatever, 12 seconds. Then what the player does is they play using the time code in their part as a framework, as an anchor, so that if they're playing too fast and they're too early at the time code of the next bar or the next bar, or too slow, they can moderate the speed at which they play. So it's constantly changing, but they do this by looking at the stopwatch as well, which is usually on their music stand. So it's a case of moving from the notation, checking the stopwatch, moderating what you're doing backwards and forwards. And then when they are at a rest and they've got 15 bars of doing nothing, they don't have to sit there and count the bars. They just wait for the watch to come to 12 minutes, 33 seconds, in you go. So it really is a very user-friendly, very simple kind of device. The challenge is for the musician to actually not feel compelled by the time code, which is operating at 60 beats per minute as a conceptual kind of framework, and to be playing in the notated tempo that is down. But I found with the orchestral players, I use orchestral players as an example because the orchestral culture is very different to ensemble and chamber music with regards to being experimental with ways of performing. But in the orchestra, they got the hang of it. I mean, the first rehearsal they had all together was brilliant. By the third run through they had, it was absolutely spot on. And we ended the rehearsal session 1.5 hours early with a recording take, because, and I had people coming up and saying, oh, that was fantastic, that was fantastic. So I think that once the initial fear and unfamiliarity is gone, then the method of using printed time code, stop clock time work code, and being flexible between those two, being as close as you can, but not feeling as if it's a rigid thing, then you also get a degree of musicality that's released in that, and expressive freedom. So that's what I would say for that.
Thank you. And one question by Helen Ko, again for Marc. Marc, can you talk about how your work with music performance affect your painting? And then I would extend that question to Philippe, since I know that you're also doing some installation work, if there is any sort of continuation with polytempo. But first, Marc, how's your painting?
Okay, I'm currently writing a book about this. It's called Music, Painting, Landscape and Me. And it is an exploration where I'm asking myself a lot of these questions because they're not easy to answer. First of all, let's say I do not work on the basis that there is an exact translation of meaningfulness from painting to music. You cannot look at brush marks in one and say this corresponds to a B flat and a C sharp or whatever. I don't. That's not what I'm talking about. But there is a way that as as a living being, as impulses, sensations come into my body, as I hear things and I see things, as I experience things. They go into my brain, they are embodied, and through various processes, some of which are biochemical, some of which are neurological, some of which are probably emotionally motivated, stuff comes out the other side. And that stuff is embodied in painting or in composition. They are linked by an association, very broadly speaking, as far as I see it, between sensation and performance. So, for instance, the way that you experience the world around you when you're out on a walk is very much dictating the way you actually walk. And the walk itself can become a physical embodied performance of how you're responding to sensory information around you. When you paint, when you draw, there is also a physicality that's involved in that. And I think there's a sort of transduction that goes on between all of these sensory things that moves through one's own hermeneutics, one's own interpretation, and thought is embodied through action in artifact. So I'm sorry, that's probably a really rambling answer. It is not an easy question to say, because I can't really go into the romantic things and say, oh well, this piece of music makes me feel like this, and makes the hair on the back of my neck tingle, and so my painting's going to have a bit of red in there because I think that's to do with something hostile. And I can't go down that kind of metaphysical language because it's not where I operate. But there are links between all of these things within our wonderful bodies, and there is meaningfulness in all signification. So everything we signify will have meaningfulness. Not necessarily mine. It's to do with the performer, it's to do with the viewer, it's to do with all of us. Oh, there we go. That's
Thank you, Marc.
Sorry for the ramble.
Philippe, your installation.
And now you want me to answer how this all connects to my sound installations.
Or if...
Well, no, not at all. I mean, I don't have the... I don't feel that everything I do in my life has to be all the time connected. So I have different, even in my artistic work, I have different fields. I do sound installations, I do electroacoustic music, and then instrumental music, and they can be separated. So yes, of course, in sound installations, there is this idea of it's also computer generated, and there are sometimes a lot of speakers standing in the room. So there's this idea of spatial music as well. So there are connections, yes. But probably a good way to end would be with a very personal outlook. I haven't used all this tempo polyphony or tempo thinking in my electronic music. I think my electronic music is more concerned with the spectral aspects of music, with sound and so on, but not with rhythm and tempo. So probably that would be a direction I should go in the next the next years to see if I can translate these ideas from instrumental music to purely electronic music.
That is going to be my question for closing this talk. So maybe since Philippe, you opened that topic already, maybe can you say a few more words about how that translation may be, or what exactly are you interested in implementing in your electronic music from tempo polyphony?
Frankly speaking, I don't know. Because many of the problems of synchronizing musicians and somehow indicating the tempo and the different tempos to all the musicians is not an issue in electronic music, because it is as it is. So probably I have to go more into the psychoacoustic phenomena of hearing regularity, irregularity, and how, I don't know, pulse strands can probably so these kind of minimal music phasing ideas, how they can diverge and converge. But to be honest, I don't know. That's really something to do more research on and probably go for it in the future.
Maybe a more lighter question. What is next for you? As a researcher or as an artist, what are both of you, your plans for the next section of the year? What do you have coming up?
Well, just following on from what Philippe was saying, some of the things that I want to develop are blended approaches where I'm using a conductor and my timecode supported polytemporal music, or using a conductor who moves around an ensemble and highlights a particular area to synchronize them whilst everybody else continues on in their polytemporal realm, but where the polytemporality runs throughout. So it's a bit like a sort of synchronization spotlight that moves across the orchestra to different areas. On the technological front, I work with a group of artists here in the UK called SatSynth, and Ralph Hoyt is a poet and a mobile an audio producer, and Phil Phelps is a musician and a coder, and we work with mobile phone apps to create geolocated soundscapes. And what this basically means is that with the new software that Phil has developed, we are able to create auditoria that you can walk through, which has sounds in it that can be triggered by your locality, position and speed and directionality. So it opens up from the point of view of polytemporality, spatialization, not just from where a musician is, because you can actually put yourself into the middle of an environment from which the sound cascades out around you, behind you, over and across you. It also means that the sounds can be generated and initiated by your physical position in that space. So the notion of co-authorship goes onto a different realm, because the audience are not just a passive ingredient in this. They are actually building the sound with you. So it is a case of many possibilities, confining those possibilities, creating the program. I don't do it. I'm crap at maths. I let somebody else who's good at it do it. And then generating the idea, the concept for a piece, and then those ideas proliferating in space. So you go out, you download the app on your phone, you go out into a park or a woodland or wherever, you press a button, the app unfolds this virtual auditorium, and then you explore it on foot. I think that's very exciting. I think that's really exciting as a development for polytemporality, and it uses more technology than I would normally delve into.
Wow, so much more to come. Yeah, thank you very much, and that was very inspiring, and also thanks to the audience and the thought-provoking questions, and yeah, so much more to learn and explore. Yeah, that's it for today, and yeah.
Thank you so much for everyone who joined today. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Philippe, for sharing your research, your insights, your artistic and creative practice and questions with us. And we look forward to, keep an eye on you and see your new projects.
Thank you very much for hosting, and lovely to meet you, Philippe. And thank you for everybody who's been watching.
Then happy Saturday, everybody.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.